Welcome to the second episode of Square Talk. My name is Philip. I'm your host, as well as a content and brand manager at Squareshot, a product photography service based in the US. Today we're going to chat with Keith Krick. He's been a photographer for over 20 years. He specializes in still life and product imagery. He's also worked on many projects as a producer and now leads the New York studio for Squareshot. Well, let's get into the episode. Okay, welcome Keith. Hi, how are you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
Good. So this is our second episode, and I'm really glad that we bring you on here because you are the perfect candidate to speak on just general content photography and product photography and catalog photography. So from all the people I know that are in the business, you probably have the most experience. Can you just run me down, like in general, about your background and just want to talk about how you started, where you started, or were some of your first gigs?
Wow. Okay. So I've been in this game for a very long time, since the late 90s. Started off, going to university for photography, 4-year program at RIT. Then after that, I started exploring different facets of photography, such as architectural, lifestyle, fashion, automotive, still life, product, catalog. I worked as an assistant for a very long time. I moved around the United States in different markets. I lived in Tucson, Arizona, Chicago, Illinois, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and then ended up in New York City. For a long time, I worked as not only a photo assistant, but I also worked as a producer. I worked as a digital tech. And then I also worked as a still life and product photographer. So I explored many facets of this industry. And I really sort of wanted to explore what the industry had to offer before I settled somewhere in it. Because I didn't want to be a jack of all trades, that's like a master of none kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I really wanted to see where I fit in this whole realm of photography and where I felt most comfortable and happy. And it ended up that shooting still life and products and objects was a great fit for me.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think the industry, the product photography, or just in general, the content creation industry has changed since you began and right now, after COVID especially?
Oh, man. I mean, I started like at the very beginning of digital photography.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I first started, it was film.
Mm-hmm.
And you shot film was scanned, and then you worked on your digital files through a scan, and then coming up through this, it's just then digital cameras started coming into play, tiny little sensors. The technology was really basic, it was very crude, rudimentary. And through the course of all of this, it just kept getting better and better and better. And it gave access to photography to a lot more people.
Mm-hmm.
And then now, just with the advent of not only digital photography, but then social media, imagery and image production just exploded. It just became available to everyone. And it also became a resource for everyone to sell their wares, move their goods, show their work. A lot of people who didn't have the access to show their work suddenly had, the internet, suddenly had websites, social media. The same with product photography. It was catalogs. You would shoot catalogs and you would shoot like 4 times a year, or you would constantly shoot on a monthly basis, and they would print this stuff out, physically printing this, and then you would mail it out or whatever, or or it would just run in magazines. And that sort of slowly started to disappear, and everything became an online format, to the point where, everyone had a computer room in their house, to the point where now everybody has a powerful computer in their pocket, and everything has now just become immediately accessible, like immediately. And that wasn't the case many, many
Mhm.
years ago.
It also feels like product photography, especially, grew exponentially, as did e-commerce. Did you personally feel that, impact of the e-commerce boom that happened over the last few years on, for example, your work, even like before Squareshot? And
Yes. So when I started, there was no such thing as e-commerce. It didn't exist. So the impact of it has been overwhelming now, because especially ever since the beginning of this pandemic,
Mhm.
you know, everything switched to e-commerce, and the entire world and your consumer has been just impacted by it in a way that that's what they do now. That's how they shop. That's how they look at pictures. That's how they look at products. A lot of brick and mortar stores have closed. A lot of businesses have closed and just shifted to online sales. And it's just the new way of doing things, and it's not going to change, and it's just going to continue in that direction.
Mhm. Do you feel like, essentially, the boom of like iPhones and just phones in general, sort of, that people can consume their content through small screens, kind of devalues just in general professional product photography, or just professional photography?
I myself and a lot of my colleagues would agree with that. It really has devalued the craft of what we do now, because there was a time where you actually had to know what you were doing when you were shooting film, and you had to be able to read a Polaroid. You
Mhm.
had to be able to know what your lights were doing, and then when you shot the film, you didn't know what it was going to look like until you got that film back from the lab
Yeah.
and looked at it on a light table through a loop, and then got it scanned. Now everything is just completely immediate, and it opens up the world to a lot of people who didn't have a lot of like photographic training to really become photographers now.
Mhm.
So we are now in a market oversaturated with photographers, and we are in just a world just oversaturated with content now
Mhm.
because of that, because we're just bombarded with imagery everywhere we go, whether it's on our phones, on television, ads that pop up while we're online, electronic billboards that are everywhere. We are just bombarded with imagery. So there are now more content creators because of this. So, and in order to stand out, you have to be very good at your craft. You really have to know what you're doing, because I think people from the start, they really couldn't tell, but now you can, a lot of consumers and a lot of just average people, they can really tell now what is a bad image and what isn't.
That's my next question, kind of, in an oversaturated market, how you differentiate from a good or a bad photographer, and that kind of also aligns with a good or a bad studio.
Wow. Okay. That's very subjective. You know what I mean? In a way that, what I think is terrible or rubbish, somebody might think that it's okay.
Mhm.
And it just it goes with the, I guess, the amount of experience and time that you have put into this, and how much you can read into an image and what you can see. details in the highlights and the shadows and the focus and the contrast and the saturation and, any kind of other technical things that you can like look at and read and study from an image. Or people can just be like, oh, wow, hey, that's a nice looking picture. Or like, man, that thing just looks terrible. Like, I don't even know what it is.
I mean, that's something that you and I recently talked about. It all boils down to how do you define image quality, right? And then that also kind of is dictated by where do you see the image? Is it on, for example, Shopify, right? Where you're going to have to cut down the quality, the resolution of the image to, by a lot. So it's, now being able to be held by that platform. What is like the first thing that pops into your head when you see like a bad photo? How do you notice that bad photo right away?
It's just after doing this for like 20 years, it just comes naturally. Like, you can just look at it and be like, man, this thing really sucks. How did somebody even approve this? And why was a client even happy with this? Mm-hmm. So but then that goes back to being oversaturated now with studios or photographers that really don't have that technical capability or that vision to be able to see or even understand what is bad and what is good.
Mm-hmm. And so, okay, I'd like to introduce this reoccurring segment where I'd like you to pick a stereotype about content production, just product photography or whatnot, and try to like break it. Because I know that there are plenty, especially about, for the outsiders, maybe for photographers that are just starting their job, or maybe even for e-commerce clients. What would it be in your eyes?
Wow, this is really interesting. Let me just take some water here for a minute and just think about this. It's a really good question. One stereotype about e-commerce photography could be that, it has to be cheap and dirty, where I really think that e-commerce photography should be on the level of near advertising quality because you are selling the product. Regardless, if you're looking at it on your phone, a quick, dirty, cheap picture, it's not going to entice the consumer to buy that product. You want something that's going to look beautiful, so you put the time into it to make it look beautiful.
Do you see that people undervalue currently the role of catalog photos just in general in terms of the success of their products?
I don't think so. I think people are really starting to understand the value of it because so many people need this resource to sell their product online. And they really understand that a good photo will sell their product better than a terrible looking photo.
One of the biggest things that I realized recently is that e-commerce doesn't actually exist without catalog and product photos, which is absolutely crazy to me. This point because it's literally the foundation, and it feels like at this point it should be almost like part of the production cycle where something is soon to be released. It has to be even done before on the concept stage, and it's crazy that sometimes it's being like the last thing that people perhaps think about it. So
well with a lot of our clients, a lot of stuff that we shoot are prototypes, photo samples. Because all of that imagery, that it has to be created, approved, and done before their product is released. So there's so much in the development stage that goes into the shooting stage. So then once an entire collection has been photographed, then then you can release it to the general public. Most of the stuff that we do is like at least a year out. Or a year and a half out. Yeah. So it's a very interesting process where, you're basically looking at the future.
And that's why probably like the turnaround times and anything of that sort, when we're talking the scale of a year, right?
Mhm.
Those like 8 days, for example, turnaround time doesn't seem so long after all. If that's something, if you're like shooting collections or anything of that sort.
Well, it's just that like our turnaround time to produce something, that's just a small sliver in the production that our clients have to do afterwards with that image, with marketing. And that can take months.
Hmm.
Then they have to, there's a lot of assembly of, getting websites ready, getting all of their social media ready. There's a lot of production involved with the images that we produce after the fact.
Hmm. And there's one thing shooting finished products, but it's entire different story when you work with samples, right? And so both your photography team and your post-production retouching team has to go to like an additional length to actually make those product kind of resemble of the finished ones.
Yeah, that's correct. So like a lot of the stuff we get, like I said, are prototypes and samples. So they might not even look like the finished product.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of work on the back end, especially in post production, in order to clean up these products. Because sometimes we'll get, photo samples and stuff in where the colors have to be changed, pattern has to be changed, or a part on that product all of a sudden changes. So then they need an additional photography made, and then a new image created out of two to make
Hmm.
what the actual product is, in the very end of it.
Things you got to do to actually cut the time to market for
Yeah,
all your products. And so
yeah.
this is going to be a big one. So do you think that product photography will ever be automated?
Well, I mean, they have these machines now that you can put stuff in and they'll take imagery for you.
Hmm.
You'll still need an operator, but it's there will be a more automated side to this, just like everything else that's happening around us.
Hmm.
I'm not the one to say like never say never or that will never happen, because when I started out, all of us were like, film will never go away. And yeah, it's still around,
But for
but
aesthetic reasons.
yes, it's very, it's just another part of the medium that's still used, but not on the level that it was
Mhm.
used in the past, which was 100% of the time. So now the same with automation with this stuff, that I could see over time a lot of product photography being automated for, I mean, I don't even know. I can't predict the
I mean,
future.
it makes sense that, for example, if we have a brand and that brand has a motor product, so essentially the same shape, it's going to be the same size every single time. It makes sense for these automated machines to be bought essentially to supply that imagery. But if
Hmm.
we're talking, like, for example, take Squareshot, right? The amount of products we photograph over a monthly basis, they all come in very different shapes, very different sizes, and it takes some time to actually set up for those. Do you
Yeah.
think that, like, in the near future, like, let's take 5 to 10 years, do you think machines, like those, the ones that are automating this process, will be able to be that flexible?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure, but I'm sure somebody will try to develop something so that it can be.
Hmm. Okay, so I want to know this. Since the industry is, even though it's young, it's been, around for a while. I want to talk to you. Are there any traditions, product photography traditions, for example, or that
Hmm.
you'd like to see go? Like, for example, in the last episode of Square Talk, we talked with Alex, right? And we talked about productization. The way that, for example, the
Hmm.
pricing works right now in, some of the parts of the industry where we're not talking complex projects, right? Those that have to be absolutely, priced by hours, because there's no way around to price some of the creativity that goes into it because it's so subjective. But it seems like a lot of companies just in general could benefit from going into like the route of productization. Are there anything similar to that that you see that it's time for that to go and it's only slowing down the industry, not the other way around?
We're always changing and developing, new styles and new techniques or new formulas or new ways to bill, invoice, shoot, create. I really don't see like anything that I would per se want to see just disappear and be completely eliminated.
Mm-hmm.
I just would rather work on what we do well and improve that part of it.
Mm-hmm. What is your opinion right now? How does the current landscape of product photography is? So there's a huge separation in terms of like the size of studios. So you go like into freelancers, for example, and then you have these a little bit bigger studios that are, that probably are called like product photography services and whatnot. And then you go to like bigger brands, and then you end with super huge studios that, for example, work with Nike or like work with Puma, for example, like Slate Studio or Line Studios. So what do you think? What is the future in terms of landscape? How is it going to change? Are we going to get more freelancers? Are we going to get more studios that are more oriented towards branding? And
well, I mean, the freelancers in the studios, they'll I'm sure that they'll always be around because a lot of studios hire freelancers.
mm-hmm.
So in order to, not have such a huge staff and the way that, the influx of products or jobs and orders, they come and go. Certain parts of the year are busier than others. So during those busy times, you would hire more freelancers to, take on that workload. And then as things would taper off for a few months, you would just go back to, your normal staff, and then it just ramps up again. So
doesn't that impact consistency?
Well, it impacts a lot of different issues with as far as, this also goes even with like supply chain issues, and then certain times of year when products are released or dropped, or, holiday seasons, or, your fashion weeks and everything like that,
Mm-hmm.
and when collections need to be done. It really wouldn't really affect that, I don't think. I really don't see how it would.
Well, let's talk case scenario.
Yeah.
So let's say there's a brand, and that brand is shooting their first collection, and per se that because the size of their collection is big enough to be spread into like 2 different days or maybe weeks. And what's going to happen if you have essentially multiple people working on that? Is that going to impact the consistency between the shots? Or maybe, for example, if we're talking, let's say the brand released their first collection in September, for example, and then they come back in May, right? You're now going to have 2 different people doing the job. So how do you, as a brand, as an e-commerce brand in general, how do you maintain that consistency?
You hire professionals. That's how you maintain consistency. Professionals will be able to know how to go back to what they shot the last time, or read the raw file or the images or the lighting and everything to replicate it the next time. And it also just keeping data, notes, what kind of lighting, what kind of set was used, what kind of camera, focal length on lens, any kind of data at all. And anyone that I've worked with, any professional could walk in somewhere, read an image, look at some of the data, look at the photo, and be like, I can replicate that. And then,
I mean, that's why. That should be a big thing for people, for brands who are about to start shooting, their first collections. That should be a big thing that should impact their choice in general, who they're going to work with. Is this the studio that's going to grow with you as you progress, as you get more, products in, is this the same studio that's going to be able to keep up, essentially delivering the same standard across the board? And the same thing goes, like, for example, you start to grow, your supply chain changes. Is this the studio that can also scale with you, right? Go into like different cities or like states even. And that's a big one, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's why hiring professionals, if you're really serious about your brand and your business and your image quality, you go with a professional service that can produce this for you consistently, month after month, year after year, and keep it consistent.
Mhm. How do you think? Do you believe that within the next 5 to 10 years, are we gonna get more studios, or are we actually gonna go more into like freelance photographers?
That I cannot answer because I don't know how the economy is going to change. Like during here in New York during the height of the pandemic, a lot of studios closed. A lot of like studios, they've been shutting down.
Mhm.
They reopen. You have a lot more people who worked at those studios who then became freelancers because they lost their in-house job. So now they need to go somewhere else. Or the other thing that's happened is a lot of people have moved out of major cities and have been opening studios across the country in smaller or even unknown markets because the real estate is cheaper, the cost of living is cheaper. And, when stuff is just shipped back and forth on a truck somewhere, you kind of just you can be wherever you want to be.
Mhm.
So in order for a lot of places to save money, they've moved out of town.
Mhm.
They've moved into other remote parts of the country, or just smaller cities where they can still have their space and do all of their work but not have the insane overhead that they had at one point.
Okay, let's picture a case scenario. There's a new brand, and there's a decision to be made whether they're gonna go into a freelancer, right? And they're gonna shoot their first products. They're gonna decide between going to that or a bigger studio, or perhaps if their budget is big enough, they're gonna consider even building their own production, which seems to be a really tough thing to do these days. But what do you think? What are your recommendations?
Well, I mean, you said the magic word, budget. So you can have a lot of companies that start up that don't have a lot of funding, or other ones that happen to have a ton of funding. So it really depends on your budget. So if you're an e-commerce brand that happens to have a lot of investors who can pour a ton of money into it, of course you're going to spend more on imagery. You're going to spend more on marketing, social media presence, everything. But if you don't have a lot of money, or, you know, or just in a sense, a very small budget, you have to be really calculated on what you do with that and your time. So choosing the right photographer, studio, is a huge part of your budget.
Mhm.
So, a lot of our clients, they don't, they're very small. They don't have enormous budgets. So they come to us to fulfill their needs.
Mhm.
Now, there are other brands that could be like, well, we can just build our own studio in house for a little bit because I know this guy and I know this and I got a deal on this real estate and I know this person and that, and they might they might want to invest in that. And it's just it all comes down to budget.
Mhm.
That's really what it comes down to, is how much money you have and how you need to spend it.
And what would you say is the key difference between a freelancer and a studio?
You could just go to a freelancer and be like, can you please help me shoot this project? And the freelancer will give them an estimate on how much this would cost. Or you go to a studio that provides all the services, and then they will get an estimate and give them an estimate as well. So it just depends on what fits your budget and what fits that estimate.
Mhm. Okay, and there's a really big discussion to be held on the topic of hero shots, and
Mhm.
some people might know them more as sort of semi-advertisement concept photos that are gonna serve as your Instagram content. Perhaps
Yeah.
maybe go to your website, maybe be the front page images and stuff like this. And there seemed to be like a big discussion about the complexity of that, why it's so hard to price that as well, why, for
Mhm.
example, it's much harder to productize these images than simple, I don't want to say simple, but like catalog photos. So
Yeah.
what is your take on this? Why is there so much gray area and area for interpretation in terms of these hero shots?
Because every one of them is custom. It's a custom vision. It's a custom idea. So every one of them has to be handled in such a way that it suits the client's needs for what they want.
Mhm.
So there are so many variables that are involved that you really can't put that into a cookie cutter format, because it could involve props, it could involve people, it could involve on location, it could involve splashes of water, it could involve animals. I mean, you don't know until they present you with an idea, and then you have to break it down and give them an estimate on per project basis.
And when do you think that brands should start actually thinking about those? When, like, is it count by how much they grow, or is it something that they should start as soon as they have their products already? When do you think these kind of shots are utmost of biggest necessity?
I mean, it's very important because you have to stand out now. You look at so much content, you're scrolling through so much crap on your phone. You're bombarded with ads all the time. We're subjected to so much imagery now that you need something to stand out that isn't basic, something that just like screams "buy me," or just like this is the lifestyle that you want. You know, so brands, they need to think about this all the time, because I mean they're in competition with each other. They're in competition with other brands, and they're in competition to get the consumer to buy their
Mhm.
stuff. So they need to stand out. So they have to think about this stuff immediately.
I mean, but it seems like the biggest difficulty about these hero shots or semi-advertising shots is the fact that it's very subjective. And so, what are your general recommendations are to brands in terms of how do you align your visions with photographers? How do you reduce the time or the amount of takes you're gonna get with a photographer? How do you even because that's gonna affect your budget as well. So what can you
Yeah.
do as a client beforehand, before going into this area, to make sure that both yourself, the freelancer, or a studio are on the same page?
Well, a lot of pre-production is involved, and it starts with a vision and a layout, like a concept. Like this is the style that we want to go in. This is the direction we want to go in. Here's a storyboard, a mood board, inspiration. This is kind of what we want to see. We want, for instance, like wristwatches in sand. This is the direction we want to go. What is it going to cost to make this picture?
I mean, and the big thing, because it cannot be productized and it cannot be essentially priced per shot or something like that, how, as
Mhm.
a brand, do you sort of have a grasp or a hold on, not going over budget? Because it seems like if there's so much subjectivity involved, you can literally go on for days without, having a final result. So how do you make sure that it doesn't go into that, area?
That's where having a good creative team or somebody handling this for you and not trying to do it by yourself, because that's where you start. Well, if you're not educated in the process, you won't know how much it costs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you hire a marketing team, or some kind of production team to sort of tell you how expensive or not expensive your vision is, will sort of be able to put you on the right track within your budget.
Mm-hmm.
So you really kind of got to know how much it's going to cost. And with a lot of like startups or inexperienced clients, they just really don't know how expensive things really cost to produce.
Mm-hmm. And do you think there'll ever be a scenario when these hero shots can be productized and turned into, almost like purchases where that you can predict? Is there a world that's going to happen?
I can't predict the future with that. That's a tough one to answer. Because of just like with everything, it's just like you never say never. So it might become more streamlined. You might be able to start calculating factors in a easier, more calculated way. But as at least for what we're doing right now, everything is so all over the place and so different with what people want that you kind of just have to just slow them down and sort of educate them like, okay, this is why it's going to cost this much,
Mm-hmm.
because you want X, Y, and Z in there, and that's just, and it's going to take this long to do it.
I mean, it almost seems like the more streamlined this process becomes, the less custom it becomes as well.
Well,
So
yeah,
there's there's a balance to be upheld in terms of if it's ever gonna become productized, then you might
yeah,
lose some of that, just customability and flexibility in terms of like creativity in a way as
yeah.
well.
It'll just become too
And
generic.
like one of the final topics that I like to discuss is, so there's a huge boom as well in terms of marketplaces, and it seems at this stage that the supply of these even catalog photos, just in general, does not match the demand, especially when we're talking like, for example, Fair, right? One of the marketplaces that requires a remarkable amount of photos because they'd like to, have their platform also have some kind of consistency from product to product, right? And so my next question is kind of it might be sort of a speculation, but in terms of studio growth, do you see them becoming more accessible in terms of having more locations just in general? Or do you see it growing in size, like, for example, Amazon warehouses? Or what's your take on this?
There's going to be, I mean, as e-commerce grows, as consumerism grows, as we just, consume material things on a daily basis, there's going to be more and more production. It's not going to go away.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to die out. You're going to have more and more resources to produce this much content to be consumed on a daily basis.
But do you see, like, for example, from your personal experience, do you see the future behind studios going into like expanding in terms of the amount of points there are across the map, making it more accessible? Or do you think the future is essentially having big or high volume studios, like, for example, the size of, I don't know, Amazon warehouse, to have, many products and many photographers working at the same time? How do you see them progressing?
It could be both. It depends on the size of the company and what the company does. Amazon has multiple studios all across the country. They have certain studios that shoot certain things. One is product, other could be lifestyle, other is fashion, people. So they have multiple facilities. So it all depends on the size of the companies in the business and their fulfillment centers and logistics. So you could have some companies and some studios being centralized somewhere where everything just comes to them, or you have the model where you're spread out everywhere and, each one does a specialized kind of thing. But that just sort of depends on what each company wants to do and how they model their business. I do see that there's just going to be more and more of these because more and more people are buying stuff online and more images need to be made. So you just really, really need to have more locations and facilities to produce this type of content and this type of work for the consumer.
I mean, it almost feels like in most cases you have, because the products rarely come from the actual e-commerce commerce stores. They usually come from the supply chains. So it almost seems like a good idea to build the studios around those supply chains in the first place. And I feel like with the likes of there and any other big marketplace, as e-commerce grows, it feels like right now it's kind of outgrowing, the demand is outgrowing the supply. So it kind of makes me hopeful about the speed at which the studios, just in general, content production is going to grow in the future.
Yeah, it's a very unusual thing right now. I mean, we like at least over here right now today, on this very date, October 1st, 2021. We have supply chain issues in the United States. There's about 60 ships, container ships, sitting off the port of Long Beach waiting to be unloaded. So everything that's in there has to go to the consumer or has to be photographed, so there's going to be a backlog of things. So where does all that stuff go once it gets here? So it depends on who owns it, who's distributing it, who's photographing it, who's consuming it, and where is it going to go?
I mean, yeah, it almost feels like at one point or another, and I'm sure that's already happening across the board, but photography or content production, or even probably mostly catalog photos, is supposed to be part of the supply essentially right away, or the production, where maybe there's a world where these studios are actually happening where the products are being manufactured or distributed. Because look, it doesn't have to then go into the actual store and then go back to the actual studio. So,
I think that happens in China. I don't quote me on that, but it just might, where they'll just make it and then shoot it and then distribute it, But I mean, that's on a major scale.
I mean, hopefully it's coming soon.
Not everyone owns their own factory.
Yeah.
Production facility. I think it happens over there, but you can't quote me on that.
Okay, I won't. Okay, Keith, thank you so much for coming to this episode. This is the second episode of Square Talk. Great conversation. I think there's a lot of good insights that we kind of explored, and great topics, and always a pleasure having a conversation with you. So thank you, and have a good one.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on. This was a great experience, and I hope to do it again sometime soon.
Oh yeah, for sure. The second season definitely coming.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Yeah, have a good one.
All right, you too.